So today I'd like to talk briefly about a collection of poems called The Flickr Tree, Okanagan Poems. It was published in 2012 and was written by eco-critic and poet Nancy Holmes. It's a collection that wrestles with what it means to settle and stay on unceded First Nations territory. So this paper springs from my doctoral dissertation, in which I'm writing at York University. Last fall, after finishing my doctoral exams and my dissertation proposal, I took a teaching position at Selkirk College, partly in order to be closer to my field of research and what was my home throughout a very turbulent adolescence in the Okanagan Valley. Before I start discussing settler narratives, I'd like to acknowledge that British Columbia's Okanagan remains the unceded territory of the unconquered Okanagan Sioux people. So I'm just going to show you the territory here. So it's a giant swath of land. This is from the Sioux website, a photo from there. So for the Sioux who have resided in the region since time immemorial, the land granted to them by the Creator to be enjoyed, managed, and protected in perpetuity is understood as mother. This understanding of the region runs counter to many of the settler narratives that I examine in my doctoral dissertation, where the Okanagan is characterized as a forgotten space, or perhaps worse, as nowhere. In many of the texts I look at, including those by Patrick Lane, Harold Renish, John Lent, and of course Nancy Holmes, who we'll be discussing today, this ahistorical sense of nowhereness is pervasive. Historian Justine Brown argues that it is a sense of nowhereness that has long underpinned settler British Columbian understanding of its own geography. With this sense of nowhereness comes the belief that the province resists or somehow defies articulation. In many of the contemporary texts in my study, this sense that the land is empty or forgotten is confronted by the Okanagan Sioux people. So it is against these fantasies that the land is somehow empty that Jeanette Armstrong, Okanagan author, educator, and activist, and one of the region's most well-known voices, has long sought to assert and teach Indigenous presence, and with that, Sioux ecological ethos. So Armstrong, who argues for the primacy of story in sustaining, shaping, and creating the land, contends that today's stories, faced with the present dark age of ecological illiteracy, should speak to and teach the people to be. So with this, Armstrong urges writers and critics to attend to the polyvocal history of the here that is attuned to the particularities of place and to bioregional perspectives. So historian Jean Barman, Armstrong, and George Bowring all argue for the primacy of geographic space in the analysis of literary works from the province. Bowring suggests that it is an uneasiness with British Columbia's geographic space that forms one of the unifying themes in provincial culture, and that home, or more specifically, the attempt to find and make a home, may stand as an informing symbol of the culture. So for those of you who are new to Nelson, you probably noticed this hippie ethos, and there's a lot of trying to find yourself in British Columbia's interior valleys and on the coast. So we have a long history of utopian communities where people go to try to find and make a home and try and determine what it is that makes a home. So in the literature from the province, we see this very often, right? This is a theme that recurs over and over again. How do we find and make a home in this place that we don't understand? So my doctoral dissertation, which examines how competing interests and agendas express themselves in contemporary literature from and about BC's interior valleys, is particularly interested in the question of how the geographical context of human life informs the finding and making of home. So what does it mean to write this place you're living in as a settler? This is a question I keep returning to. And how does that geographic space inform how you understand yourself and how you understand your home? So this project reads region through Lorraine Code's model of ecology, a model that Code defines as a rethinking of established theories of knowledge and relations between humanity and the other than human. and understands ecology as a study of habitats where ethos and habitus are enacted, and where differences between and within a bioregion are articulated and negotiated. So she's looking at all of the tensions that exist in a bioregion, between the humans and the other than humans, right? Okay. So by examining regionally connected narrative constructions of place, I propose that we might further our understanding of how individuals and communities of diverse cultures and backgrounds work to imagine, shape, and preserve sites of origin and arrival. As I mentioned, my project focuses on the Okanagan region, which rests in the southern heart of British Columbia and straddles the American and Canadian border. My work aims to observe contemporary literature from this region as particularly potent sites of confluence and conflict, where Wild West mythography is confronted by its colonial crimes, where the Ensayaksin language and the Sioux culture work towards a resurgence, and where environmental pressures are increasingly felt as the narrow valleys contend with fresh waves of settlers who place new demands on finite resources. So the Okanagan has one of the highest levels of biodiversity and concentrations of species at risk in Canada. It's a fragile dryland region, which, since the arrival of settlers in the 1850s, has undergone increasingly radical agricultural and urban development. It is a space where ecosystem degradation is acutely perceived by conservationists, writers, artists, and local residents, as human impact on the desert terrain scars the landscape. So for those of you who have been to the Okanagan, who've been to the Okanagan, you can see that you see these dry hills reaching up towards the green. And it's on those dry hills you see subdivision after subdivision, vineyard after vineyard, running right down to the lake. So human impact on the terrain is acutely perceived by those living in those valley bottoms. In a way that in southern Ontario, for instance, or if you're from a larger center, you don't see it as much because you're immersed in the tall buildings, in the skyscrapers. But when you're living in the valley bottom and you're watching human encroachment move up the hill, you can see how that is scarring the landscape and putting increased pressure on the finite resources, on that lake. And there's constant conflicts over water use there, right? Because it is a desert region. So water becomes a particularly tense issue there as golf courses are spreading, as orchards require water. Okay. All right, so to bring us back to this collection of poetry that I promised I'd talk about, I'll briefly look at a text where these tensions that I just mentioned are acute. This is Holmes's fifth collection of poetry. It's called The Flickr Tree, the Okanagan Poems again. It's a collection of poems about place, people, plants, and animals in the Okanagan Valley in the southern interior of British Columbia, where Holmes has lived for the past 20 years. Holmes, who is a creative writing instructor at UBC Okanagan, organizes eco-art projects in the Okanagan Valley with Denise Kenny through something called the Eco-Art Incubator. It's a large-scale project that endeavors to foster research, production, documentation, and dissemination of eco-art in the Okanagan Valley. In this project, graduate and undergraduate students are linked with community artists, ecologists, activists, and scientists through a comprehensive series of Okanagan-based resource projects. So many of the poems in this collection spring from her work on the Woodhaven Eco-Art Project in Kelowna, BC. It's one of the Eco-Art Incubator's many initiatives. The Woodhaven Project was an artistic endeavor that took place in the Woodhaven Nature Conservatory Regional Park from April 17th to November 6, 2010, so for a very short period of time. Local artists, including students, musicians, performers, writers, sculptors, and other visual artists, created multiple works of art in the park and in response to the park. The artwork has minimal impact on the natural environment, leaving nothing in the park and similarly removing nothing from the park. In one Woodhaven project of particular note, graduate student Laura Claire Howarth created a site-specific durational installation of a border patrol service at Woodhaven Nature Conservancy. Haworth's project investigated and critiqued the separation of wilderness spaces from civilization spaces in contemporary culture. She investigated our relationship with borders, both international and metaphorical. So she set up this border crossing, and she had a border guard there. And so you would, in order to enter the park, you'd have to sign in and declare who you were and what your intentions were. And it seemed like an amazing project. And if you're interested, I'll let you know more later. Okay, so in Holmes's collection, The Flickr Tree, similar issues are explored through the particularities of place, as regionally specific ecosystems and other than human residents challenged and are challenged by settler-imposed ideological frameworks that assert themselves over and into physical space. So this collection is split into 3 sections: Living Beings, Okanagan Plants and Animals; This Place Here, Okanagan Places and People; and Woodhaven, A Crisis of Place. Holmes interrogates moments where the other than human urges its own other towards self-reflection, so where the animal urges the human to see itself. In her poem Senclip, the Unceded Okanagan word for coyote, a trickster figure, the corpse of a coyote pup inspires the poem's speaker to imagine Coyote, Senclip, rising from death and from the ever encroached upon endangered grassland, wearing a jacket plastered with billboard bling, loving it, strutting around in garish ad jewelry, wearing sunglasses the size of swimming pools, kicking out the homeless, snakes, owls, pine trees, and other weaklings, and gleefully rejecting myth and story in favor of a capitalist fervor, and finally exclaiming, "Rip up the place, rip, rip, rip." These kinds of acerbic turns abound in Holmes's collection of nature poems, so she problematizes the word nature throughout. As is the case with many so-called nature poems, Holmes's poems have more to do with the speaker's embodied and emplaced subjectivity than they have to do with geography. In these poems, Holmes critiques her own complicity in settler consumption while playing with the traditional form of the nature poem. The dead coyote puppy, which might initially appear in her poem as another victim of human encroachment on wilderness space, rises up, gleeful, ever the trickster, to remind the reader that it is not he who is imperiled, but human culture bent on its own destruction. Holmes, who spent over 20 years in the Okanagan, is not so much concerned with settling, as is the case in many of the narratives from the Valley, which chart initial arrivals and early uncomfortable settlings. So you see a lot of pioneer stories rising from the place, or a lot of stories about what it was like when I first arrived. So to stay in Holmes's lyrics requires a long-term ethical engagement with place, while to settle entails blind and destructive appropriations. Holmes's lyrical meditations on staying on unceded First Nations territory challenge other regionally situated representations of place, including those of naturalists, tourists, and developers, and even scientists. In her poems, like Guidebooks, Wild Flowers of the Southern Interior of British Columbia, and Off the Path in the Dark Woods, the scientific language of bioclimatic zones and the naming of flora and fauna are shown to be massively inadequate and problematic in the face of the embodied experience of place and of Syilx's presence. In Guidebook, the Nsexan names are often in Latin or English rather than in their original names. And these names bestow the Okanagan's flowering plants. These imported names are placed on the Okanagan's flowering plants and trouble the speaker, while the intersection of disparate bioclimatic zones creates what the speaker facetiously calls a crisis of place. In Off the Path, imported appellations and regional descriptors sit uneasily in the Okanagan. So Holmes's series of nature poems repeatedly recognizes the primacy of indigenous Syilx epistemology and a personal alienation from this knowing. In the poem Landing, Holmes's speaker describes being in one of Jeanette Armstrong's classes and of her experience of listening to Jeanette Armstrong speak in Nsexan, and then writing down words they cannot say. ashamed of her own handwriting, and longing to discern in the words they cannot understand the place that they dwell, which remains beyond comprehension. So Holmes's collection closes with the poem Guide's Last Words, and with the line, "Ask yourself, ask the rattlesnake, could you stay?" Here I argue that in asking this, Holmes provokes an ethical response from her readers, urging them to consider what it means to stay and what the ethical implications of long-term habitation are, particularly within a fragile ecosystem and on unceded territory. My wider project has sought to listen to the many voices that communicate the Okanagan and the bioregion, and to be attuned to how these voices create what Robert Crouch calls the imagined real place. These imagined real places function as what Lorraine Code calls instituting imaginaries. They have the capacity to disrupt and defamiliarize master narratives and their pretensions of naturalness and wholeness, and to imagine places that initiate counter possibilities capable of interrogating and making new established social structures. Holmes's lyric poetry and work through the eco-art incubator provokes an ethical response from contemporary settler culture as it works to promote new instituting imaginaries and new ways of staying.